Hello, everybody. Joe Moore here, CEO, co-founder of Psychedelics Today, joined by Matthew Baggott from Tactogen. How are you today?
Doing well, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Happy to have you. This is going to be a fun one. I invited you on today to talk about the recent FDA advisory committee meeting on the MAPS MDMA project. And you've been making a little bit of a tour, so I assume you have some really great insight to share with us on this whole process.
Hopefully. My view does seem to kind of diverge from the headline takeaway that a lot of people had, which was that the meeting was disastrous for Lykos. And in some ways that's true, right? I mean, clearly, like the top line vote was very much against, the committee members feeling that the efficacy of the treatment had been demonstrated, and also therefore that the benefits, didn't outweigh the risks.
Right. So, before we dig in, what are you doing at Tactogen? Just so people know that you have a good reason to be able to speak on this topic.
Sure. Yeah. So my background is, as an undergraduate, I became interested in MDMA, and I got a job in what was the first lab to study the potential toxicity of MDMA and related compounds. And this was at University of Chicago in the 1980s. So this is the lab that Bob Schuster and Lou Seiden had. And they trained like George Riccardi and a number of other prominent researchers on neurotoxicity questions. And then I worked there full time when I graduated. After that, I moved out to California, and I got a role at UC San Francisco in a lab. Of course, my cat will knock something over during a recording. I got a role in a lab that Alexander Shulgin, Sasha Shulgin, was affiliated with, and he'd come in once a week and work on various projects with our head chemist. And we became the first group to get federal funding to give healthy volunteers MDMA. And this was in the mid to late 90s. And then I went on, after those projects wrapped up, to help MAPS get their first patient trials started. I led the writing of what's called the investigator's brochure, which summarized everything known about MDMA. And so this would be the document that a pharma company would give their investigators at a site in order to bring them up to speed. And having helped with that, I haven't had any formal involvement with MAPS or Lykos since then. And I've often disagreed with decisions they've made. And one of the things that I disagreed on was that I thought it was important to start working on new molecules that would be next generation versions of MDMA. And after spending some time in industry, leading a team at Genentech, I co-founded Tactogen in early 2020 to do just that. So we've been working on making gentler, what we hope will be more accessible molecules that we hope can meet the need in a way that MDMA might not be able to. Although, of course, MDMA has a lot of promise and is going to help people, at least based on the evidence we know, it seems like it will. It's also going to have some limitations that prevent it from reaching as many people as one might like, given the size of the need with conditions like PTSD or alcohol use disorder.
Yeah, brilliant. So that's amazing. I didn't realize you had such a long history here. So that's really helpful context. Yeah. So digging in, just for to set the stage, what is this meeting that happened at the FDA somewhat recently?
So FDA has about, I think, 26 maybe advisory committees that they can convene in order to help them think through topics. And so they'll sometimes be asked to evaluate a proposed treatment where a company has submitted a new drug application, and FDA is evaluating that new drug application as to whether the evidence shows the treatment really works, and then do the benefits outweigh the risks. And this is, it's just an advisory committee meeting of outsiders, so it's not a vote by FDA, and it's also not binding. And statistically, in cases like we saw with Lykos, where the committee votes against recognizing that the data show efficacy, FDA still does go on to approve those treatments eventually, maybe 30%, a third of the time. Although using those past statistics is maybe questionable in really unusual cases like the meeting that we saw recently with the Lykos MDMA application.
Mhm. Um, so the advisory committee did vote that they don't really support this coming through the FDA yet. There needs to be a little bit more research, or a lot more expensive research. And in some cases, that's a justified stance. I like to take a weird stance here. Things can be also true and false in many different ways at the same time, and that's a really hard thing for a lot of people to sit with. So um, this idea that at the same time, yes, the FDA doesn't think it's safe enough to come through. On the other hand, we have so much great safety data on MDMA. And then if we look at the PTSD situation in America, at least it's not pretty, suicide rates, etc. So like, I don't know too many ravers or people that are killing themselves after Burning Man, maybe a couple, but like, 45 a day in like the veteran population alone, like that's such a tragic number. So I don't know that the FDA really cares about what's happening outside. They're held to like a really strict process. Is it like a really science-based process that they're kind of working through, or how do you see their process?
One, of course, hopes that it's science-based and objective, but with any kind of regulatory agency, there are also political pressures, really from both sides. And my hope and trust is that in the end of the day, the science and the data will win out. And I would maybe slightly reframe what you just said about safety. So it's important to distinguish between what FDA is signaling to Lykos in their communications, and then what the kind of message has been to industry. And so we can break this into efficacy and safety. So efficacy is the evidence that the treatment actually helps people. And then we can consider safety. And as you rightly point out, we know a whole lot about safety just from the fact that MDMA has been studied in maybe, definitely more than 1,500 participants in studies not sponsored by Lykos, and 22 million people in the US have taken it. That's 8.6% of people 18 or older. And it very rarely causes any clinically meaningful problems. And the risks we know about are generally manageable ones in a clinical setting with screened participants and medical monitoring. So it's not really like safety is a serious concern. It's more that FDA has a list of things that they expect in a new drug application. And there are a few things that they're looking at in the Lykos application that weren't there. And so they're just noting these. But if you pay careful attention to the way they describe those in both the briefing document that they released before the meeting and in their slides and oral presentation at the meeting, these are largely issues that are fairly minor, will traditionally, at least in most NDAs, not slow down approval and can often be addressed after approval. And so the label safety can be potentially misleading. These are issues in the category of safety, but they aren't like serious safety concerns. They're more just FDA has a list of things that they expect, and some of the things are missing, and these can probably be addressed in reasonable ways that may or may not even slow down a potential August approval for the medicine.
Very interesting. Okay. I like how you put that. That feels really optimistic. So one thing that I struggled with was the fact that MAPS Lykos had FDA breakthrough status for this project. And the way I kind of see that is FDA is kind of riding shotgun, providing a lot of support along the way, because we haven't had a real breakthrough treatment in a long time for this condition. And they were excited, and they have a whole process around that. What is that what is this breakthrough status designation? And then what were some limitations around it that, maybe led to this recommendation from the committee?
Well, the thing that's, I would say, is even more important than the breakthrough therapy designation
Mm.
it is the existence of what's called a special protocol assessment. So in general, you can ask for and get a breakthrough therapy designation if you're treating some serious condition and the preliminary evidence suggests that your proposed treatment is significantly better than what's available currently on the market. And so you ask for that and FDA can approve it. And then if you get that, you get certain advantages in that you can get extra help. You get more attention from senior leadership, and you get kind of an accelerated process, and all that's helpful. But what's I think particularly salient in the case of the Lykos new drug application is this special protocol assessment, and that's a process whereby the sponsor Lykos works with the agency FDA to agree upon a protocol for the phase 3 trials. And once they've had this agreement in place, the sponsor gets a formal letter from FDA that says, we agree that this study design will be sufficient to make a decision as to whether or not the treatment works. So Lykos got that letter in place. And so there are legitimate criticisms and limitations of their trial design, as there will be for any study. Studies can only answer a limited number of questions, and so there will always be open questions at an end of a study. And it's certainly the case that from today's perspective, there are a lot of things you would do differently, but this agreement on the ability of the phase 3 trials to show efficacy or not that was reached back in 2017, it's still valid. And so although FDA went into a lot of detail on why the trial design had limitations, that was largely directed at companies like Tactogen and the industry. And so, in some ways, if you saw reports from CEOs of companies saying, yeah, Lykos did a bad job and, we're doing better jobs, they're kind of misreading what FDA was saying. What FDA was saying is that essentially, okay, we now have standards. We've published an guidance to industry in 2023 for clinical trials of psychedelics. And so there's a lot of things that we expect now, but those weren't all in place in 2017. And so we're going to go through all those, but nothing that they said there affects the fact that if the data are good, as they do look to be, and pass audits, as we can only guess that they are passing audits because we don't have insight into that, then in the end, the FDA will accept that as showing that the treatment works.
Brilliant. Okay. So that's interesting. What, like a perennial critique here is this concept of placebos not working so amazingly well in psychedelic studies, and secondly, some sort of expectancy bias. Let's tackle the placebo conversation first. Like I get a little frustrated because I see just how expensive science is, and yes, we need to be using some sort of advanced trial design, but are like placebo RCTs like really the best we have? Is there anything like more hopeful that's perhaps less wasteful? Comparing 20 hopeful drugs instead of like drug plus placebo. I don't know. Your thoughts there.
So you definitely learn different things from placebo comparisons versus active drug comparisons. And in a perfect world, you'd have both. A problem. So the thing that you're trying to control for is that if everybody in the study, including the participants, including the researchers, can tell who's in the active treatment arms and who's getting placebo, then you might have a problem where people in the active arms who don't respond drop out. You might have a problem where therapists decide to focus more on helping the people with the active treatment because they think that they're going to benefit more from it. And so the placebo group might be relatively neglected. Things like that, and also, there might be some kind of feedback where if you feel the drug is working, you get more hope, you have more optimism and hope and optimism can help you to, be motivated to work more on the therapy, and you might have a better outcome. So the things that we worry about in that kind of design are in these situations where you've got a placebo are not in strong evidence in the Lykos trials overall. And a reason that you would want a placebo group would be that you really can get a clean sense of side effects associated with the drug versus ones that just happen in your population independently from the pharmacological intervention. And that's, can be a big issue. Like in populations where you have worrisome things like suicidal ideation and behaviors, you'd really like to have a reasonable sense as to whether your treatment is increasing that. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems with active controls is that the reason you've picked an active control is that you think it will have some overlapping side effects with your proposed treatment, which could potentially fool people, but you think your active control will lack the therapeutic benefit. And so you start to get into a situation where you're going to have comparable side effects in both groups, and you can no longer distinguish what's inherent in the patient population, what's an effect of your active control, and what's an effect of your drug. So there's problems with having placebos, but there are benefits too. Now, really, nobody expects these trial designs to really work out well, no matter what you do. And it's just a matter of you should try so that when you go to publish the paper or when you submit it to regulators, they say, okay, well, they did their best. But everybody understands that there are no good solutions. And so the current recommendations are to use some kind of active control. And one thing that's a potential thing to do is to use different doses of your treatment drug, where, say if you're studying psilocybin, you might give a dose that you expect to not cause a real trip. And if you think the trip is therapeutic or is part of the therapeutic outcome or mechanism, then you might expect to see fewer participants given the low dose experiencing clinical relief, whereas a medium or a high dose should be more likely to cause that. And so if you see a nice dose response effect, then you can say, okay, this really is the drug. The problem with that potentially is that you may just not have linear effects. And Lykos actually tried using low doses in 2 of their phase 2 studies. So some of the preliminary studies before these big phase 3 studies that were designed to really kind of nail down the efficacy. And what Lykos decided was that it looked to them like having a low dose of MDMA that was somehow anti-therapeutic. They decided that it was increasing the dropouts and also maybe like stirring things up without being helpful. And so
I think we saw that in some of the earlier data too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I'm referring to, like the Peter Owen paper and at least one other study. And so they were giving things like 25 or 30 milligrams, and they were seeing that the CAPS-5 score is the main measure of PTSD severity that they're using as their outcome measure, was, if anything, getting worse. So I've always questioned whether that apparent worsening with those low doses was something that was a true drug effect, or whether it was something more limited to the design of these trials, because I've given similar doses to healthy volunteers and found that they were well tolerated, variable effects, but no one had any negative experiences. They either had positive MDMA-like effects or just very mild feelings of relaxation, but nothing worrisome. But it's fully possible that in patient populations you get a different response. They might be more just anxiety sensitive to feelings that you're no longer in control and your body's somehow being pushed someplace by a drug. And also it's possible that if you're in a clinical trial and you've been really hoping that this would solve your issues, and then you experience what you think is a clear drug effect and yet you don't get relief, that could be really depressing and cause you to lose hope. And so you might get that kind of phenomenon in a trial in a way that you wouldn't if you were just taking a low dose as a person not expecting meaningful relief from disease states. So, so what the guidance that you would get today on designing a study would be: consider using a low-dose active control, or maybe another drug that has some similar physiological effects, so that you could potentially fool participants and researchers. And also maybe do a measurement at the beginning as to what people expect to happen, and then at the end ask people what they think they got. And if you're really doing a nice job, you might ask the researchers what they think the people got. But those sorts of guidances weren't really in place when Lykos did their trial design with FDA back in 2017. And so the idea of asking people what they think they got was something that got introduced into this set of studies in 2020, after the participants in the first phase 3 trial, MAP1, had already been unblinded. And so there's only a bit of data on the sort of influence of what you think you got on outcome, or actually the causality might be the other way. The outcome might partly drive your decision as to what you think you got. We only have that data set for the second phase 3 trial, what's called MAP2 in the Lykos naming scheme. And, ultimately, like, these are later considerations, aren't part of the agreement on efficacy. They do play into FDA decision-making in a subtle way, in terms of if FDA has questions about how long the benefits last, then they might ask for more data on exposures beyond 3 exposures to MDMA. So these phase 3 trials used 3 active MDMA administration sessions. And if you thought that wasn't enough because people might need to get additional MDMA treatments later on, then you might want more safety data. And so the measurement of blinding is something that can be used to interpret the long-term follow-up data, which could influence the decision FDA makes about how large a safety data set you need. But these are sort of like lesser issues than kind of the core issues about, did it seem to work? And, the other thing to say about all this is treatments always look better in clinical trials where you've got these a lot of vigilance to performing the trials properly. There's a lot of excitement about the medicines and things like that. And also you're studying more motivated participants than typical patients maybe. And they may be, in some ways, have less complicated cases, fewer other health problems or conditions. And so what we expect is that the really impressive results from these phase 3 trials are probably going to shrink a bit if this gets approved and gets into the real world. But in general, it doesn't seem like the size of the therapeutic benefits, the effect size, the difference normalized between the MDMA group and the group that just got the talk therapy. We don't think that could possibly go away based on what is a typical influence from expectancy or other sorts of unblinding issues. So it'll probably get smaller, but I would be surprised if it went away.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, and the placebo concept is so just a perennial psychedelic headache. Like, how do we actually come up with something that makes sense? And thanks for all the nuance on both of those questions. Yeah, it would be fascinating. I was trying to brainstorm, like, could we just use straight methamphetamine? But we might actually see a clinical benefit from straight methamphetamine. We don't know. And it's very structurally similar. So, which would be really interesting, because it's a quite inexpensive, long-lived drug in the pharmacopoeia already.
Absolutely. And in fact, back in the, I think it's 50s, maybe even 40s, though, methamphetamine was proposed as an adjunct to psychotherapy. And so there's a couple of publications out there. In one case, I think they were mostly using it for diagnosis, but in another case, I think they were using it to accelerate therapy. And they are pharmacologically similar compounds. So if you did want a really good active control, amphetamine might be a bit better from the point of view of neurochemistry. So you can think of methamphetamine as releasing norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, with more of the norepinephrine and dopamine than the serotonin. And you can think of MDMA as releasing all three, but with less of the dopamine compared to the serotonin and norepinephrine. And amphetamine doesn't really release serotonin. It'll have the dopamine and norepinephrine components. And so you could, if you used an active control of amphetamine, you could say we're comparing dopamine and norepinephrine release to release of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. And so there's kind of a nice story there, even though that's a gross simplification, of course.
So the next thing that came up was this euphoria topic. So some people thought it was problematic that the side effect of euphoria from MDMA was perhaps under-discussed. Could you talk about that a little bit? What was happening there?
Sure, yeah. So in traditional estimation of what's an adverse event, they're normally classified as things that are seen or experienced as troublesome or untoward by the participants or the researchers. But FDA and kind of pharmacovigilance has moved a bit away from that traditional view. So that traditional view that an adverse event is something that's negatively experienced is still kind of existing in the definitions used by like the ICH, the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. So that's this big standardization organization and set of documents. And if you, in fact, go back to FDA's guidance published around like 2012 or 13, they also seem to define adverse events as not being things that are positively experienced. Nonetheless, at this point in time, FDA does want to know about things that could give them insight into the potential abuse liability of the medicines. And FDA had told Lykos that in a letter, but Lykos in their protocol defined adverse events in the more traditional way, consistent with ICH and with older FDA documents. So it was definitely an oversight. The kind of the magnitude of the error, it seems fairly minor. What FDA said in the meeting was that they had enough information from the published literature and epidemiological data to make the warning label, and they could prepare a scheduling recommendation for DEA, but they wouldn't be able to quantify how often, what percent of participants in the phase 3 trials experience euphoria or whatever other labels you would want to put on these things. And so that's in some ways not a huge deal. So if you look at the label, the packaging insert for, like, say, Adderall XR, there is a table in there that has adverse events, and there's one column for the people in the clinical trial who got the Adderall XR and another column for the people who got the placebo. And you can go into the CNS section and you'll see something like maybe nervousness, and you'll find that, like, the people in the Adderall active condition, experienced nervousness at, this percent, and the placebo group had a lower percent of people experiencing nervousness. That table isn't something that FDA could make today, but there's another similar source of information that you'll see in that same label for Adderall that is just listing, without giving the numbers, different adverse reactions that you can see. And so in the Adderall XR label, you do see in the CNS section euphoria as one of the things that can happen. And in some ways, that's a little more reliable, because just because they didn't see it in the phase 3 trials, we do know that amphetamines have abuse liability and cause euphoria. And so having it in this list there is, maybe more accurate, although you can't get a number from it. And so that's essentially FDA's complaint. They can't make a table, but they can still make a list. Wouldn't be typically a thing that would necessarily slow down approval. The bigger thing to say about that in addition is that this is actually a problem for the industry for people who are developing psychedelic or psychedelic adjacent medicines. And normally when you are reporting these sorts of adverse events, you use a standardized medical dictionary thesaurus to kind of roll up different experiences and say, if somebody said that they felt thrilled or happy or joyful, you would call all of these euphoria. So you can get a number for who got euphoria. But this standard medical dictionary that we use in clinical research, MEDRA, which is another ICH thing, MEDRA is Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities. It doesn't have things like feelings of love or self-compassion or emotional closeness to other people. And so you don't have an existing way to say if people felt that those are all one category of positively experienced adverse event that would affect abuse liability. So this is a challenge for the industry moving forward to figure out how we're going to do that. So, ultimately this is, it's a data omission, but it shouldn't be a fatal data omission for the new drug application. And it does indicate an issue for the field.
Yeah. It seems like something we can get through. It doesn't seem insurmountable, right?
Yes.
Chemo meds are coming out. Like we should be okay.
Yeah. All the issues that FDA raised concerning omissions of safety data, aside from this positive adverse events, they all signaled some openness to handle them post-approval. And so there is some possibility that MAPS, Lykos, I should say, may need to collect more data, but they do have some data on these positive experiences, I think from other studies that may not have been included in the NDA. So they did a study comparing how well the drug absorbed if you had an empty stomach versus if you had a recent meal and how that influenced effects. And so they got some measures in there, and that study wasn't in the new drug application. So they may be able to just provide more data to the FDA. And in addition, FDA may just agree to a plan to collect more data as they roll out the treatment. And that seems like a reasonable approach. It does seem like the treatment, if it is approved, is going to be rolled out in a controlled, slow manner. It's probably going to be disappointing to a lot of people that were hoping that they could access it quickly, because there's probably going to be relatively few sites providing the care, and it'll probably be in, on the coasts and maybe in Colorado or places like that.
Yeah, that's a very different vision. So the next part is around talk therapy. And there was a quote in an article, I think, that came out somewhat recently, fiercebiotech.com, article from yesterday. The line was, one committee member said the use of talk therapy was the greatest strength, but also its greatest liability. And that's because the therapy part is not under the purview of the FDA. This is a really robust talk therapy protocol. Like, I don't know of this happening anywhere else, perhaps outside Esalen. But like, where are you getting like 2 people doing therapy on you for hours and, over the course of months? But yeah, how are we thinking, or how is the FDA thinking about therapy? Like, they don't regulate therapy, which I kind of appreciate, but what are the thoughts right now going on around this?
So there have been a number of medicines approved in the past where they're approved in conjunction with some other kind of therapeutic intervention. So for example, weight loss drugs like Belvic, would be approved in conjunction with some kind of weight loss program. And what this means is the label just says something very much like that. And, it doesn't specify in any detail what it needs to be, because that is outside of the purview of FDA. The healthcare providing is much more, of a state-regulated kind of thing. And so the expectation is that if the Lykos MDMA application is approved, that it would be something similarly short and not non-specific. It would be something like, approved for treatment of PTSD in conjunction with psychological therapy. The sort of more complicated aspect is how are, say, like payers, insurance companies, going to view best practices, and how long will it take us as a field to get to the point where there is some kind of consensus as to what best practices are for the psychological therapy that you should get with MDMA or with any of these other innovative psychedelic treatments. And there's kind of two things that you can say about this. First of all, the most conservative thing would be to try and replicate what was done in the clinical trials, because that is the approach where we have evidence it works. And so if you look at what's happening in Australia right now, a lot of the sites there that are starting to do MDMA therapy are trying to duplicate the approach that's in the MAPS manual for psychotherapy. That just seems like it's the conservative thing to do. But on the other hand, though, that's not really an evidence-based approach. It's got this kind of peculiar history where, starting several decades ago, if you asked the people who had done MDMA therapy when it was still an unscheduled compound what they did, you would have gotten all these answers from people, like George Greer, about what they did. And a lot of them were influenced by kind of the LSD psychotherapy model of Stan Grof. And so you end up getting something that has like that influence, but also like more contemporary influences like internal family systems. And that kind of grab bag approach of the things that seem to work is not something that's ever really been measured and compared to evidence-based therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy or EMDR. So we're also going to see comparisons. And indeed, if you look on clinical trial registries like clinicaltrials.gov or look at the Australian, New Zealand version of that same site, you can find that there are projects where people are trying to pair MDMA with exposure therapy or EMDR and other things. And so we are going to hopefully start to get a sense as to, which approaches are useful and, ultimately which ones might work with which patients. And at some point, we're going to need to have the kind of the standard professional organizations that come up with guidelines to step in and actually work to develop guidelines. And, also, of course, there's all kinds of ethical issues that haven't been fully worked out. And I had the privilege of being part of a retreat that worked on a consensus statement on where there was consensus and where there was a need for further work on ethical issues regarding psychedelic medicines. And so this is a paper that came out in JAMA Open Networks, just actually, on the same day as the FDA hearing. So
was this the Mason Marks one that he was working on? Yeah,
exactly.
Cool.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important document. And, I'm honored to have been a small role participant in that whole process because it included stakeholders from across the spectrum.
Yeah. So, did the FDA guidance have anything about ethics included?
The 2023 FDA guidance on conducting clinical trials, I'm not certain to what extent. It was a relatively short guidance, and it's mostly just do things the way you normally should if you know how to do clinical trials. There are some considerations that FDA has, and you can see this also in the proposed REMS that they included in their briefing documents for MDMA. There are concerns that participants in the clinical trials and patients in the clinics, once these medicines and treatments start to get approved, there are concerns that people are impaired, and we have to understand the nature of the impairment and how long it lasts. You know, in a perfect world, you would get people to agree not to, you know, make big decisions in their lives for some time period, like after the session. But at the same time, you do understand that people are going to get insights that they'll be, you know, have an urge to act on. So there are definitely open issues there. You know, one of the most controversial things, of course, is the role of touch and whether and when that increases risk of boundary violations. And it's, you know, clear that touch for safety, like to help someone walk across the room to use the restroom, is always okay. But there are open questions as to when therapeutic touch is okay. And, you know, there are, of course, traditions of therapy in which that's used, but in the sort of talk therapy, that is, you know, what most people think of when they think of therapy, touch typically doesn't happen. And so coming to understanding of how to get consent and under what conditions that's okay, I think is still an open question. You know, I'm a basic science neuroscientist, so I don't really have expertise to evaluate psychotherapy. But, you know, if it were me, I'd be like, let's just not have any touch until, you know, we have good evidence from controlled trials that it's actually therapeutic, because it does risk blurring boundaries in ways that can lead to trouble.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. What other major lessons were learned here from this advisory committee? Is there anything we missed?
So, you know, we've covered a little bit about efficacy, and that it may be that we've been, you know, maybe misled that the FDA was more talking to industry, less to Lykos, and that the efficacy issues are in some ways settled by the agreement on the protocol. We talked a little bit about safety and how these are data omissions, but they aren't necessarily ones expected to cause problems. And in the most part, they're ones that shouldn't even slow down an approval. We talked a little bit about the REMS, the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, which is you know, a set of procedures that FDA and the sponsor Lykos would come up with to ensure that the rollout is safe, and that if any problems do occur, they get detected. So there are going to be things in addition to, you know, having a prescriber available to make a decision as to whether or not you should give the second dose when people are, you know, ready for a booster dose. And you're going to have 2 healthcare providers, one of whom will be licensed. At least this is what FDA is proposing. In addition to that kind of stuff, it does look like the rollout will be slow. Lykos is going to focus on certifying sites of care and ensuring that they are doing things safely. And so that means that we're not going to see just kind of a blockbuster drug that everyone can access in year 1 or 2 or 3 even. In addition to that, I think a big lesson from this advisory committee meeting was that there's still a lot of work to be done in educating healthcare providers. So if you had no background, hadn't been paying attention, and then you were given the documents from Lykos and the documents from FDA, and then you heard the mix of opinions that was expressed by the public in the meeting, the vast majority of professionals involved in regulating the industry or providing healthcare or studying medicine would say, yeah, I don't know if this works. I'm not ready to recommend this to my patients. And so that really does indicate a need for a lot more work on education and just bringing along the culture.
And the education part's interesting. So what's a way that could, how could that look? Is that like a Mass General Hospital kind of putting stuff out and saying like, hey, we're doing workshops, we're going to do some education around this? Or like, how would you see that working in an ideal world, education of HCPs?
So what I think would be ideal is for there to continue to be funding for independent research on what works and what doesn't, and then amplify those results. And ideally, this is stuff that's not even done by the drug companies. But, you know, the truth is that there's typically a lot of work done by pharma to educate prescribers about how to prescribe their medicines. And
Right.
so, this is a
No
major
addiction
source
potential
of
here.
activity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
And so, I expect we'll see that as well. Like, successfully rolling out a new treatment is a huge amount of just person-to-person work, where you have drug reps that help the prescribers and the care providers figure out how to get the medicines approved by the insurance, how to work through any kind of slow points. And all that kind of work is going to happen too. But I think the real slow, important work is independent research that helps us to figure out what is, optimal, what is best for patients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'll second your notion that we need a lot more independent research outside the scope of biotech funded research. It is essential. Matthew, a line I've been using lately is on account of there being so much more psychedelic use today than there ever has been in history. It's nearly a public health imperative that the government starts spending on this. So we have really, really great data that is from universities, from independent researchers that we can really, really trust, because apparently there's a little more trust in universities and scientists than biotech. So I would really hope we can do that. A group I work with on that matter is Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, and we're working on federal science funding for scientists. So cannot wait for that to happen.
Yeah, that's great. The federal government has spent like $460 million studying MDMA, but the vast majority of it is just looking at concerns about toxicity. And it's still difficult to get funding to do work on how to increase benefits and reduce potential harms to patients if these are being used as medicine. We have seen Matthew Johnson getting some funding to look at psilocybin for smoking cessation, but most people who've applied for projects like that have not had success. It's still a difficult thing to get funded, and so there may be need for foundations to step up and help move this forward.
Agreed. Yeah. I was chatting in person with Gouldalyn in Aspen the other day, and she was mentioning very specifically this serious problem of inflation in science, and the science funding has not proportionally increased to that inflation at all. So we're having a really interesting crisis in science in real time. So agreed that we need a lot more funding, not just from the feds, but from foundations. That's really important. So thanks for that point. Anything else you want to mention before we work towards wrapping up here?
I think we covered the important topics. To me, the bottom line is that the efficacy data look good as long as it passes an audit. And I think that it's still not impossible. There's still a good chance that it'll get approved in August. But if it doesn't get approved in August, I expect it would take at most one more cycle to get done.
Well, I love hearing that. That's really optimistic news, and I hope we can see it in the near term. So thank you for being here. Everybody check out Matthew Baggott's work. Check out Tactogen. They're doing some really interesting work. And just another quick plug for Tactogen before we wrap, if you don't mind.
Sure. So Tactogen is working on making safer, more accessible, and more effective MDMA-like treatments. And our goal is to have medicines that are gentle enough that you could take them potentially outside of a clinic, like in your own home with your partner or with someone else. We think that MDMA is going to help a lot of people, but it's not a perfect drug and we can do better. We're interested in dialing down cardiovascular effects, but also some of the things that people report outside of the clinical trials, but which I think are real phenomena, like the midweek lower mood that some people report, or the fact that with repeated use for some people, you get diminishing therapeutic effects. And we would like this to be the kind of treatment that you can repeatedly go back to as you encounter challenges in your life. And so at this point now, we're trying to move into clinical trials with some of our most promising lead candidate molecules. We've got a number of those that we think are better than MDMA in different ways. And so hopefully we can eventually move these into the market and make them available to people.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Quick shout out for Vital, our training program, 12-month training program. Applications are open now for September. If you want to learn more, vitalpsychedelictraining.com. All right. Thank you, Matthew. And I hope we can do it again in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks.